In 2017, the Jehovah's Witnesses received an award for an exhibit of indigenous culture at a convention in Bolivia. While this recognition may seem like a genuine attempt by the organization to celebrate and promote cultural diversity, it also raises questions about the broader impact of Jehovah's Witnesses activities on indigenous cultures. Beneath the surface, the organization has a long history of converting indigenous communities, often requiring them to abandon their spiritual and cultural traditions, which the Watchtower Society views as incompatible with their faith. This approach mirrors the controversial history of the Catholic Church's role in North American residential schools, where indigenous children were forcibly separated from their families and stripped of their cultural identities. And both the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Catholic missionaries have been driven by the goal of converting indigenous populations. And in both cases, these efforts have often resulted in the suppression or eradication of traditional practices. The Jehovah's Witnesses' mission to convert people and indigenous people has often involved a deep-seated rejection of traditional spiritual practices. Indigenous customs, beliefs, and rituals, including practices related to ancestral worship and animism, are often deemed pagan or demonic by the Jehovah's Witnesses. This is even evident in Africa. In their global literature and outreach materials, the organization teaches that indigenous spiritual practices are influenced by Satan and his demons, and new converts are often encouraged to reject these traditions as part of their commitment to the Christian faith. This practice can be traced back to the organization's early activities in Bolivia, where they have been active since the early 20th century. And Jehovah's Witnesses in Bolivia have grown significantly with tens of thousands of members across the country. Their outreach strategies often focus on marginalized communities, including indigenous populations. However, their teachings require these communities to abandon traditional practices, which are often central to their cultural identity. For example, the belief in Andean deities is a key aspect of indigenous spirituality in Bolivia. Jehovah's Witnesses, however, view such beliefs as idolatrous and incompatible with Christian teachings. New converts are often pressured to abandon rituals associated with these deities, as well as other ceremonies that have been passed down through generations. In effect, the Jehovah's Witnesses' approach to conversion leads to a form of cultural erasure where indigenous people are asked to distance themselves from their ancestral heritage in favor of a monotheistic Christian worldview. And this form of cultural suppression is not unique to Bolivia. Similar efforts have been documented in other parts of Latin America, Africa, and Oceania, where Jehovah's Witnesses have been successful in converting indigenous peoples. In many cases, their presence has been welcomed due to the social services they provide, such as literacy programs, and the fact that they present the Bible in their specific languages. However, these benefits often come with the expectation that converts will reject their traditional beliefs and practices in favor of the witnesses' teachings. The parallels between Jehovah's Witnesses' missionary work and the Catholic Church's role in residential schools in North America are striking. The residential school system, which operated from the 19th century into the late 20th century, was part of a broader effort by the Canadian government and various Christian denominations, predominantly Catholic, to assimilate Indigenous peoples into Euro-Canadian society. Indigenous children were taken from their families and placed in church-run boarding schools where they were prohibited from speaking their native languages, practicing their cultural traditions, or participating in spiritual ceremonies.
I love to preach. I love to talk about Jehovah. Whenever I'd read the experiences of pioneers and missionaries in the yearbooks, I wanted to feel the same joy and the same feeling that they had. When I heard about the announcement about the campaign, I knew that that was my chance. The first challenge was the pressure I got from others. Why go somewhere so far? You could use that money to travel somewhere more beautiful. You could even travel to another country. These types of comments did affect me a bit. Other times it was more a question of finances. I once had to decide whether I would accept an opportunity to work at a good job in the public sector or whether to turn that opportunity down. But participating in that campaign was my chance to do more for Jehovah. I knew this experience would be life-changing. Throughout the campaign, we met so many sincere people, some who had never heard Jehovah's name or who didn't even know what a Bible was. One experience that stuck with me was when I tried explaining to someone what the Bible was, and then her eyes just beamed when she understood that it was a message from God to her personally. There's a Bible student who is Indigenous, and whenever you talk about Jehovah, her eyes always light up. She always asks to learn more about Jehovah. We would study over the public telephone because she lives in a village that's about a 5 days journey away. But even though it was challenging, she made it to the meetings. She would bring the whole family, sometimes up to 20 people would walk into the Kingdom Hall. I would bring a Bible, a phone and a tablet, and I would pass them around and try to help them. There's no doubt that having these experiences was well worth it. I know that participating in this campaign was the best decision. I started to truly see Jehovah as a real friend. And it was also wonderful to spend time with a variety of brothers and sisters during the campaign. It helped me mature spiritually. I planned to go for a month and ended up staying there for 5 years. If I could, I'd do it all over again.
And the goal of the residential schools was not only to convert Indigenous children to Christianity, but also to erase their cultural identities. The churches running these schools, particularly the Catholic Church, viewed Indigenous spirituality as pagan and sought to replace it with Christian teachings. And this cultural suppression was often accompanied by physical and emotional abuse, which has left a lasting trauma on Indigenous communities across Canada and the United States. And the impact of the residential school system was devastating. By the time the last school closed in the 1990s, generations of Indigenous peoples had lost their languages, cultural practices, and spiritual beliefs. This cultural genocide has been widely condemned, and in recent years, the Catholic Church has come under increasing pressure to apologize for its role in the residential schools. Pope Francis issued a formal apology in 2022, acknowledging the harm caused by the Church's involvement in the system and calling for reconciliation with Indigenous communities. And while Jehovah's Witnesses do not employ the same coercive methods seen in the residential school system, their missionary work can result in a similar outcome: the erosion of Indigenous cultures. And both Jehovah's Witnesses and the Catholic Church operate from a framework that views non-Christian spiritual practices as inferior or harmful. And this religious worldview inherently conflicts with the spiritual traditions of many Indigenous cultures, which are often deeply connected to their sense of identity and their relationship with the natural world. Jehovah's Witnesses, much like the Catholic Church in its colonial efforts, seek to convert Indigenous peoples by encouraging them to abandon their traditional practices. And this form of cultural suppression, while less violent than the forced assimilation of residential schools, can still have long-lasting effects on Indigenous communities. For example, when Indigenous people convert to Jehovah's Witnesses, they may be required to stop participating in communal ceremonies or celebrations that are tied to their traditional beliefs. Over time, this can lead to the fragmentation of Indigenous culture as younger generations grow up without the knowledge or experience of their ancestral practices. In contrast to the overt violence of the residential school system, the Jehovah's Witnesses approach is more subtle, but can be equally damaging. And by framing Indigenous spiritual practices as demonic or pagan, The organization fosters a sense of shame and alienation among converts who may come to view their cultural heritage as something to be rejected rather than embraced. And this internalized conflict can lead to a deep sense of loss and disconnection from one's cultural roots, mirroring the emotional and psychological trauma experienced by survivors of the residential schools. So, the award given to Jehovah's Witnesses in Bolivia for promoting indigenous culture reflects a complex and often contradictory relationship between religious organizations and the communities they seek to convert. While the exhibit may have been an effort to acknowledge Bolivia's rich cultural diversity, it stands in stark contrast to the organization's broader mission of religious conversion, which often requires the rejection of indigenous spiritual practices. And this tension is not unique to Jehovah's Witnesses. It is a recurring theme in the history of Christian missionary work, from the Catholic Church's role in residential schools to other Protestant efforts around the world. In both cases, the religious conversion has frequently come at the cost of cultural erasure, leaving indigenous communities disconnected from their spiritual and cultural heritage.